When I first started thinking about what would come next for us after the Unraveled series this summer, I was feeling a lot of heaviness. And if our discussions were any indication, I think to some degree we all were. Many Sundays it felt as if the collective heart of our community was breaking. We've been walking through difficult times, and I've been really struggling to connect with the source of joy. Honestly, when I looked out at the world around us, some days, all that I could see was barriers and boundaries, sickness and pain. I saw loss and injustice, anger and violence and unrest. Oftentimes, I felt as if I was being buried beneath the weight of grief and anxiety. So I felt pulled to dig a little deeper, to investigate a rootedness in joy that is ours to claim and celebrate. This summer, on one of my walks, as I was listening to Kate Bowler's podcast, I was introduced to Anthony Ray Hinton. If you watched Just Mercy this summer, Ray Hinton was Johnny D's friend and next-door neighbor on death row. In Alabama history, Ray Hinton is one of the longest serving prisoners on death row, and one of the longest serving prisoners ever to be freed by evidence of his own innocence. In 1985, Ray Hinton was convicted of murdering 2 people in Birmingham, Alabama, and he was sentenced to death. He was held on death row until the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously overturned his appeal in 2015, and all charges against him were dropped by the state. 1985, 2015, 30 years for a crime he did not commit. Kate Bowler interviewed Ray Hinton on her podcast, and I was just blown away by his resilient faith in the goodness of God and humanity. I was blown away by the hopefulness that I heard in his voice, the resolute joy that he seemed to be grounded in. Here I was in the comfort of my middle class, middle American privileged life, walking outside with the sun shining on my face. And often days I was struggling to find joy. And Ray found joy on death row. I listened to this interview, and then I listened to others of his interview, and I decided to check out from the library his memoir, The Sun Does Shine: How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row. There was something I was so curious about. How is it that after all he had endured, he wasn't hardened? Ray Hinton is a man who endured injustice that I struggle to even fathom. Ray Hinton was innocent. He had passed a polygraph test. He had an airtight alibi. He was punched in at work, and other people vouched for him. But none of this mattered. In Alabama, his all-white jury sentenced him to life in prison. And then his white judge, wanting to be elected by white constituents who desired judges that were tough on crime, his judge changed his sentence to death. To say that the prosecution's evidence was thin is generous. But in Alabama, it seems that just being poor and black was evidence enough to convict and to keep Ray on death row for 30 years. I can't even imagine. But when I listened to Ray speak, what was so amazing to me was the perspective that he was able to find in the midst of all the awful that had happened to him. Ray Hinton has so many reasons to be angry and bitter, and yet that's not the man he's chosen to be. So I've had Ray Hinton in my mind as I've been processing this joy series. Ray seems to be living a life that is rooted in joy, despite the injustice he has suffered, despite all that has been taken from him. He seems a lot like the exiles who were looking out at their whole situation, at everything that had been taken away from them, and yet they still found a way to see and to profess a hope and claim a faith in the goodness of God. When I started exploring ideas for this joy series, lots of churches have done series on joy, and I just did a quick little Google search to see how others had approached this. And far and away, the most common approach to a series on joy is through Paul's letter to the Philippians. Now, this makes sense. The letter to the Philippians is a joyful text. At first I thought, oh, Paul, I'm not sure I want to go there. I wanted to tell stories of exiles. But then it hit me. Paul's joyful words written to the Philippians were written from prison. Paul is writing these joyful words of thanksgiving and praise of God and celebration of community while incarcerated and separated from community. I thought about Paul and I thought about joy. I thought about finding a deeper freedom when his freedom had been stripped away. And I thought about Ray. So let's dive in. I'm reading today from the letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. As Paul sees it, love, tenderness, compassion, valuing others above ourselves, these are the ingredients for joy. One of the things that popped out at me in Ray's interview was that compassion had been for him like a life raft. It was kind of funny in the interview. Kate was struck by this, and she felt like, compassion. Sometimes that feels like, oh no, more people to care for, more that I'm going to be asked to give. But for Ray, compassion had been a lifeboat. For the first 3 years of incarceration, Ray was in a very dark place. He spoke to no one. He didn't speak to the guards or any of the other inmates. He was angry at everything, and especially angry at God. You see, he had been raised to have faith in a God that would make a way. And now, here he was, innocent, and yet awaiting execution on death row. Inside of his own head, angry about his situation, he closed himself off from everything and everyone around him. He took his Bible and he shoved it so far under his mattress. He wasn't even speaking with God until the night that compassion became a life raft. In the middle of the night, he heard a man sobbing. Now, it was never very quiet on the row. There was always someone yelling or moaning or crying. But that night, this guttural sob jolted Ray and got his attention. He tried to tune it out. He went back to thinking about his own situation, how wronged he was, and how angry he was at all of the people that had done these things to him. And again, he heard a man cry out, "Oh my God, please help me. I just can't take it. I just can't take it." In his memoir, Ray wrote of this night, "The man started crying again, and I realized I was crying too. I sat down on the edge of the bed and I wept silently for a man I didn't even know, who was most likely a killer. But I also wept in the dark, all alone, in a cage in Atmore, Alabama. You didn't have to be on death row to feel all alone. And I knew there were people all over the world at this exact moment, sitting on the edge of their beds and crying. Most days it seems like there was more sadness than sense in the world. I sat there for a few more minutes, listening to the man crying. I thought again about all the choices I didn't have and about freedom. And then the man stopped crying, and there was a silence that was louder than any noise I'd ever heard. What if this man killed himself tonight and I did nothing? Wouldn't that be a choice? I was on death row, not by my own choice, but I had made the choice to spend the last 3 years thinking about killing McGregor, thinking about killing myself. Despair was a choice. Hatred was a choice. Anger was a choice. I still had choices, and that knowledge rocked me. I may not have had as many as Lester had, but I still had some choices. I could choose to give up or to hang on. Hope was a choice. Faith was a choice. And more than anything else, love was a choice. Compassion was a choice. Compassion was a life raft for Ray. Ray is quoted as saying, "For 26 years after that night, I tried to focus on other people's problems, and every day I did, I would get to the end of the day and realize I had not focused on my own." Hinton had tapped into that deep root of joy, and he held on by choosing to bring love and compassion into one of the most loveless and joyless places on earth. Compassion is one of the 8 pillars of joy the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu identified in their collaborative work, the Book of Joy. The word compassion means suffering with. It seems a paradox that a pillar of joy is choosing to suffer with another, but that seems to ring true. If all we do is think about ourselves, our situation, our needs, our desires, we can easily slip into poor me thinking. No one's life is perfect. No one is without suffering. In fact, in the mystery of it all, suffering seems to be a prerequisite to understanding and appreciating joy. Thinking only about ourselves amplifies our suffering, while thinking about and caring for the well-being of others makes our own suffering a little more bearable. This was the case for Ray in his time on death row. It seems to be the case for Paul while writing this letter from prison. And I can think of times when this has been true for me as well. Maybe you can too. Compassion is an extension of empathy. It is how our empathy becomes action. We don't just stop with feeling, but we lean in and we desire the good for another. Sometimes we're able to act to alleviate suffering. Other times there's nothing that we can do but to be with someone in love and prayer. Compassion is powerful because it transforms empathy into acts of kindness and generosity. And that sounds joyful. Compassion is a pillar of joy that flies in the face of the scarcity mindset that we're so often tempted to fall into. We bring more joy to ourselves when we focus on the joy and well-being of others. Now, self-compassion is also an important part of this joy equation. Our compassion for others flows from a place of self-compassion. When we practice self-compassion, we make peace with the fact that there are things about ourselves that are not perfect. We hold our rough edges with love and care, recognizing that we are vulnerable and we are limited just like everyone else. Self-compassion connects us with each other because we recognize that we all face challenges and we all have shortcomings. In the letter to the Philippians, it is clear that Paul wants the very best for the church that he started in Philippi. He wants this community to be joyful, and he is also filled with joy as he hears of their kindness, love, and caring for each other. The joy of others brought him joy, even within the joyless confines of prison. It seems if I desire more joy for my life, if I desire joy for us all as a community, that I will intentionally nurture more compassion. And that sounds beautiful, but that's also something that is easier said than done. Compassion isn't always easy. Later in the letter to the Philippians, we don't know the exact details, but we read reference to a conflict that was threatening the unity and the joy of the entire community. Compassion isn't easy. Sometimes compassion almost feels impossible. We don't always get it right. Ray didn't get it right every day. Some days he did focus on his own troubles. But on the days that he could think about others instead of himself, the days were a little bit brighter. In our current political climate, sometimes it feels as if we are having compassion groomed right out of us. And yet, like that night on death row, when compassion became a life raft for Ray, compassion is a choice that we can make. Kate Bowler sends an email each week in which she shares a blessing, and this week her blessing resonated with me. It came in the form of a little suggestion that speaks to compassion. The words are from Madeline Langle from her book, A Stone for a Pillow. We must bless without wanting to manipulate, without insisting that everything be straightened out right now, without insisting our truth be known. This means simply turning over whoever it is we need to bless to God, knowing that God's powerful love will do what our own feeble love or lack of it won't. I have suggested it's a good practice to believe in 6 impossible things every morning before breakfast, like the White Queen in Through the Looking Glass. It's also salutary to bless 6 people I don't like very much every morning before breakfast. This sounds challenging, but it is something I feel compelled to lean into this week. Maybe you will join me. I'm going to try to start my day by blessing 6 people that I don't much feel like blessing, and then letting it go, turning it over to God, and just see what happens. I'm going to close my message today with the poem The Heart of Compassion by Joyce Rupp. Compassionate God, your generous presence is always attuned to the hurting ones. Your listening ear is bent toward the cries of the wounded. Your heart of love fills with tears for the suffering. Turn my inward eye to see that I am not alone. I am part of all of life. Each one's joy and sorrow is my joy and sorrow, and mine is theirs. May I draw strength from this inner communion. May it daily recommit me to be a compassionate presence for all who struggle with life's pain.